How many times a week should you be working out? I know that this is a question a lot of people tend to ask, but the answer is actually kind of simple, and I'm going to give you a very easy step-by-step process you can follow to figure it out for yourself. All right, 3 simple things. So the first thing that we're going to talk about has to do with future you. The second thing we're going to talk about has to do with current you. And then the third and final thing has to do with previous you, past you. All right. So very simple, very straightforward. I'm going to walk you through it. Let's get started. The very first thing we're going to talk about is your training goal. We have to come up with a very specific training goal. I want to lose 20 pounds of fat. I want to compete in a powerlifting competition. I want to be able to do a high rocks meet and beat a certain time. We need a specific training goal. And this has to be the first step because this is what will define the process, the system, the program that we need to use to get to that goal. Okay. Without this, we're shooting in the dark. I mean, the opportunities are endless and we'll honestly just be pretty lost and aimless because we don't really have a direction. We don't know where we're trying to go. So we have to define the training goal first. All right. So one thing to keep in mind is your training goal does need to be relatively specific, but there's no pressure on whether or not you need to stick to that training goal throughout the process. All right. Now, although I recommend picking something that is relatively realistic and that you can commit to reasonably, it's okay if you start with a broad training goal and then get more specific as you go. But you absolutely need to figure out if you're training for a marathon, if you're training to hit a new 1 rep max in the squat, bench, and deadlift, if you're simply training to build tons of muscle, if you're trying to lose weight for your wedding, like you need to figure that out because that will create the overall structure. And chances are, if you can answer this, you pretty much answered the whole thing, right? The next 2 pieces are just going to be ways to add constraints, but then also tweak this. Okay, so this is where it starts. And that's why I have here in red, it's the best program or process that you can use to achieve your training goal because you're starting off with what's most optimal. So let me give you an example. For the last 2 to 3 years, my training regimen has been a 6 days per week training schedule, which is a lot, especially for a powerlifter. I compete in powerlifting at the international level. Most powerlifters train like 4 to 5 days a week. All right, sometimes even as little as 3. I train 6. The reason why I train 6 is because I've found that, at least for now, it's the most optimal training frequency for me in order for me to spread out the volume across all lifts and be primed and ready for my primary movements and all of that, okay? So I start with what's most optimal. Now, I have lifestyle constraints that may interfere with that. But for the most part, because I treat powerlifting kind of like a part-time job and I care a lot about it, I'm trying to be the absolute best in the world, I prioritize it. And so I will do whatever it takes to do the most optimal program or process that I need to use to become what it is that I've set out to become. Okay, now you may not decide to make the sacrifices necessary, or you may not be able to make the sacrifices necessary to use the most optimal process, but it's great to start there because then you can work your way backwards as opposed to trying to build into it. Okay, so again, training goal is number 1. Now, the second step in figuring out how many days a week you should be training is to consider your lifestyle. We just need to figure out how we can keep you consistent. That's it. All right. So everyone has different constraints. Everyone has different obligations. Everyone has different work schedules and school schedules and all the rest. For myself, I can prioritize my training and I do. So I will train 6 days a week. If my program called for 4, I'll train 4. I will do whatever is necessary to be the best in the world. However, not everyone cares that deeply about being the best in the world. Not everyone has that as their training goal. Not everyone can afford to have that as their training goal. And I totally understand that. That's why don't put yourself on the pressure on sticking to what's most optimal on paper and instead tweak what's most optimal so that you can be consistent with it no matter what. It's much better for you to have a program that's somewhat suboptimal, but that you can stick to, perform well and recover well for, and do so consistently, than to have the most optimal program, but not really be able to stick to it consistently, okay? So this is very simple. Like I said, just consider your work obligations, school obligations, family, all that stuff, and figure out, okay, how many days a week can I reasonably show up to the gym? How long can I be there for? And that's it. And that's so again, everything's top down. You're going to start with the most optimal process, the most optimal program, and then you're going to start to just subtract some things from it because you're looking at your constraints, right? Now, one little tip or trick that you can use to decide which days you train and how many days a week you train, rank them by days where you feel you can go in, not really look at the clock, and just perform to the best of your ability versus days you absolutely cannot. So from best to worst. The best days are obviously going to be the days that you most likely are going to want to train on. The worst days are probably going to be the days you'd rather just take a rest day, right? Now, the next piece of that is try to find a way to make that schedule consistent week after week. You don't want to have a schedule where on Wednesday you're taking off and then the next week, Wednesday you're on and Thursday you're taking off. You want to have it so that, okay, if I'm training Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, it's going to be like that for at least each block. And each block is usually about 4 weeks long. So every 4 weeks or so, you're keeping to that schedule. All right. So that's step number 2. Our light in the back just died, but show must go on. So the third and final step in this process of trying to figure out how many days a week you should train is going to be considering your training history. Like I said, this is your past self, your previous self. The reason why this is super, super important is because this is where you're going to make a lot of your decisions or tweaks when it comes to changing the most optimal program that we've already kind of tweaked based on your lifestyle and what you can adhere to, right? The most important aspects of this is we have to be progress driven. So we need to think about what has worked and what hasn't in the past. For example, let's say your number one goal was to build muscle, and in the past you were training 3 days a week and each muscle group was getting hit once a week, but you weren't really making progress. That's something that's really worth considering when deciding how many days a week you should be training moving forward, because you know that since you're progress driven, you probably should change that so that maybe you're hitting your muscle groups twice a week. And that might actually help. So maybe that means now, in order for you to do that, you have to train 4 times a week instead of 3. You see how that can affect our decision-making process? Now, the other thing too is going to be recovery. What can you recover from? Historically, what have you been able to recover from? Again, it's all circling around the same idea of, are we making progress? What's wrong? What's right? What should we keep doing? What should we change? That's it. It's that simple. So there's no need to overcomplicate this. I just want you to consider your previous training history, the progress you've been making, and how that might affect the decisions you make moving forward. Okay, so again, if you are somebody who, let's say like you're a power lifter and you've been plateauing and you've been benching twice a week or 3 times a week, and you realize, you know what? This is just ridiculous. I'm not making any progress. Maybe that means you might need to introduce a 3rd bench day. Right? So that's all I'm trying to say here. Now, I will tell you this. The literature definitely supports frequency as like a primary driver for progress in the gym, especially when it comes to muscle hypertrophy. Okay? And so, in other words, training a muscle group 1 day of the week, 5 sets really, really hard is not going to be as effective in building that muscle group than if you were to train that muscle group twice a week and do 3 sets or even 2 sets really hard on both of those days. So in other words, training a muscle group more frequently and harder, in those sessions is going to be better than just stacking tons and tons of volume into one day. So that's everything I have for you in terms of figuring out step by step the process. Some final notes in conclusion here though, because I don't want to leave you hanging dry. The first step is really, really important. Considering the training goal is super, super important. Do not neglect that. Finding the right training system can be difficult, but that's going to be the first real step towards figuring out the answer to this. And it's going to take some time. It's going to take some research. It might even take some trial and error, but you will find what works for you. And what works for you, by the way, right now will change as you grow, as you develop, as your life changes, right? And that's okay. You just need to be considering all of these variables so that you can make the best decisions when trying to move forward. And the last thing I'll say there too is, yes, there are generally agreed upon things that work depending on what your training goals are, but you also really do need to take into account what are you willing to adhere to, what can you adhere to. Someone like myself, for example, I'm not training for a marathon, right? But if you really enjoy running, maybe that's a goal that you have, and so that's going to dictate your training cycle and what your days look like and how many days you need to train, right? And so that's why the training goal is so important to consider, because everything kind of gets based around it. Otherwise, like I said, even if you think about your training history, what does it matter if you don't really have a goal, right? And your lifestyle choices, maybe you go to the gym twice a week, maybe you go to the gym 6 days a week. What does it matter if you don't have a training goal, right? So the training goal is by far the most important factor here. And I promise you will make time for the things that you really do care about. And I can guarantee you that no matter what your situation is, unless it is super uber extreme, you can make progress no matter what your situation is. we can find a way to make progress. So yeah, consider a training goal. And yeah, that's basically it. All right, I'll see you guys in the next YouTube video.